Okay, folks, can we settle down? Okay, right, we're going to start the last session of the day. I just introduced myself. My name is Michael Farrell. I'm the Senior Solicitor with Free Legal Advice Centres. And I suppose more directly relevant to this conference, I was previously a criminal defence lawyer, regularly representing people accused of criminal offences, many of whom were convicted and sent to prison. I don't think that was just because I wasn't a good solicitor. It's just in the nature of things that there's a high rate of conviction. But as a busy practitioner, you don't have much time to do anything except concentrate on the details of the case that you're dealing with. But I was always left, when a client was convicted and was sent to prison, I was always left with some nagging questions. For what purpose are these people being sent to prison? What good will it do? Will they be reformed when they come out? Will they see the error of their ways? And as this is a Jesuit initiative, will they go away and sin no more? Or will they come out of prison addicted to drugs, even if they had been clean before they went in? Will they come out permanently embittered and alienated where they had been drunk or angry when they committed the offence that they were sent away for? Will they be sucked into violent criminal gangs when previously they had just been petty thieves? And sadly, the answer was usually the one that you don't want to hear, that it was the bad outcome rather than the good outcome. So it was clear that the system does not work, and that locking up more offenders for longer periods, which seems to be the trend now, is not going to work any better than the previous version of it. So, to finish off today's session, our two speakers are happily going to address these large questions of why have our criminal justice systems failed us, and how do we shape a more effective penal system, an Irish perspective from Ian O'Donnell, and what role can prison have in rehabilitation and reintegration, by Dr. Shad Maruna. Well, we're starting with Ian O'Donnell, Professor of Criminology in the Institute of Criminology in UCD. And Ian O'Donnell joined the UCD Institute of Criminology in 2000. Previously, he had been director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust from 1997 to 2000. He'd been research officer at the Oxford University Centre for Criminological Research between 1992 and 1997, and he'd been research assistant at the University of London in 1989-92. He is a fellow of Linacre College, Oxford, and during his time in England, Ian also served as a member of the Board of Visitors for Pentonville Prison, so he has seen prison from the inside, and as a magistrate on the Oxford bench. He's a chartered forensic psychologist and an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. When I first met Ian back in, I think, 1997, when he was taking up the position of director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, IPRT, and laying the foundations for a body which would seriously and systematically critique our prison system, and which I think has contributed a lot to the debate about prison reform in Ireland today. So, apart from the academic side of things, he has also contributed substantially on the sort of lobbying and campaigning side of things. So, Ian.
Thanks very much, Michael. As Michael mentioned there, the themes of the conference, there are two interrelated ones that I was asked to cover in my presentation today. The first, why has our penal system failed us? The second, how can we make it more effective? And I was asked to place my comments in an Irish context. As I was collecting my thoughts for this exercise and reflecting on developments over the last 20 years or so, I was struck by the extent to which the penal policy arena in Ireland is characterised by a series of absences. And in combination, these absences have created a context that even the most pessimistic observer would have been hard-pressed to imagine 5 years ago. And the title of my talk, The Malign Effect of Sustained Neglect, is intended to capture the effect of this dangerous drift on the size of the prison population. The 4 lacks or absences that I'm going to talk about are, first of all, a lack of urgency, a lack of follow-through, a lack of structure, and finally, a lack of critical scrutiny. Now, these lacks aren't unique to Ireland, but they seem to be more in evidence here than elsewhere, certainly more evident than in other jurisdictions that I'm familiar with. And they characterise to a greater or lesser degree arrangements right across the criminal justice spectrum. But I think that their pernicious cumulative effect is most apparent when we look at the hard end of the system, namely the use of imprisonment. So it's the prison population that I'm going to focus on in my remarks today. And before I talk about these lacks in a bit more detail, I'm going to give some background information about our growing infatuation with the prison. And after I set out these lacks in a bit more detail, I'm going to offer a single key performance measure for the prison system and a timescale for achieving it. Now, the conference organisers also asked speakers to come up with concrete proposals for penal reform, and I have 3 of those that I'll conclude with. So, first of all, the background context about Ireland's imprisonment rate and where it stands internationally. And what I've done on this slide and the next slide is used the figures from the first edition of the World Prison Population List that was published by the Home Office in London in 1999, and the latest edition that was published by the International Centre for Prison Studies last year. And these maps show the rate of imprisonment, so prisoners per 100,000 population, in the EU 15, so the member states before the candidate countries joined us in May 2004. And given that the Irish population has grown so dramatically since 1999, there are 750,000 more of us in this part of the country since that time, I'm using rates all the time here rather than numbers so that the increases aren't exaggerated. And if you look at this map from the first prison population list, you'll see that Ireland's in a very favourable position. It's towards the bottom of the league table, if you want to think about it in those terms, with an imprisonment rate of 65, nestled there among the Scandinavian countries. You can see 60, 65 in Denmark, and so on. The EU average, when this first edition of the list was published, was 85 prisoners per 100,000 population. Ireland was 20 below average at 65. So the important number there is 20. In 1999, the first edition of the list, were 20 points below average. Now, Ireland lagged a fair way behind other European countries at this time. It was also seriously adrift of other common law jurisdictions, jurisdictions that we share a legal tradition and a language with, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and so on. In a book by an American academic called Frida Adler that came out in 1983, Ireland was described as a nation not obsessed by crime. If the imprisonment rate is any guide, we weren't a country obsessed by punishment, even as recently as the very end of the 20th century. The second map shows the situation according to the most recent edition of the World Prison Population List. This is the one that came out last year. And the message here is one of considerable change, much but not all of it in an upward direction. And I have another slide that comes after this that shows you the magnitude of the change in different places. Now the rate in Ireland is 100 prisoners per 100,000 population. It's exactly average. It's no longer 20 below. And what I've done here, just to capture a sense of the magnitude of the change, I've shaded the countries according to the change between the 2 editions of this list, so from the late 1990s up to the present. And the lighter the colour, the less dramatic the movement. So in a small number of countries, Portugal and Germany being 2 examples, the rate of imprisonment has decreased. In others, Finland and France, you can see they're a slightly darker pink, there's been very little movement, which less than 10%. So countries that exhibit a decrease or very little movement, I've grouped them together as group 1 on the slide. In some other countries, there's been a moderate increase that I define as moderate as more than 10% and less than 25%. Denmark, England, and Wales come into that category. And in a few countries, the increase can be classed as high. So my definition of high is more than 25%, but less than 50%. Italy and Spain satisfy that definition. So they're groups 2 and 3 on the chart. That leaves 2 countries outstanding, and they stand head or shoulders above the rest. Ireland and Greece. And in each case, the imprisonment rate has increased by more than half in the interval between the publication of the first and most recent editions of the World Prison Population List. I've shown the percentage change there. And I'll just flick onto this next one. Just to show here, the average of the EU 15 is the bottom bar on that chart. Ireland is next and Greece is at the top. You can see the average increase over this period was 16%, so the pace of change in Ireland was 3 times the European average. Now, I'm not going to get bogged down in the detail of how these figures were derived and so on, but there's one caveat here, which is that the figure for Greek prisoners that was used in the first edition of the World Prison Population List seems to be erroneous. It was correctly taken from the Council of Europe statistics, but the wrong figure was in them. So if we use a more accurate estimate, the change in Greece is still very substantial. It's not 85% anymore, it's 44%. So it's lower than Ireland's and would fit into the high increase group in my scheme rather than the extreme one. So Ireland and Greece would remain at the top of this fairly dismal table here, but the places would be reversed. So when we iron out that wrinkle, we find ourselves in splendid isolation at the top of the chart as the only country characterised by extreme growth in the prison population over the last decade or so. So that's not a pleasant place to be. I've noted that our imprisonment rate used to be low compared to other common law countries like Australia and England, New Zealand and Canada. Now we're distinguished by our rush to incarcerate. And the change in Ireland is out of line with the change in Canada, where the increase has been about 2% over the same period, and with the US, which has shown an increase of about 15%, with New Zealand and with Australia too. So to summarise the picture, the increase in imprisonment in Ireland is much greater than elsewhere in the common law world. It's also exceptional in an EU context. Now, we're not at the top of the table yet in terms of rate, but we're moving upwards at a fairly disturbing pace. I think there's only one conclusion that can be drawn from this picture that I've sketched fairly briefly, and it's this. Ireland is no longer a low imprisonment country. The complacency that characterised the debate for a long time here, which was something along the lines of stop griping, it's a lot worse elsewhere, was an impediment to reform, I think, in the past, and now stands as a dangerous delusion. It's important, I think, to say that, I'll just get there the other common law countries there, this shift has taken place almost entirely in the last 5 years. The timing of this is really important. By my calculations, in each of the years 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005 and 2006, the imprisonment rate fell slightly, only a tiny bit, but it fell. And I think it's a matter of regret that rather than seizing the opportunity to consolidate this development and work towards a stable number of prisoners, this was the very time when a decision was made to expand capacity on a fairly dramatic scale. Also, it's important to state that this isn't the only occasion that the Irish prison population has experienced sudden growth. Between 1983 and 1985, the rate of increase was steeper. It was from a lower base, but the trajectory was steeper. And between 1997 and 1999, there was a surge on a similar scale to what we're witnessing today. In other words, prison growth is not linear. It's not relentlessly, steadily going in one direction. And what's required is to limit the upswings and accentuate the downswings so that the overall pattern is one of relative stability. I've always been cautious interpreting data relating to crime and punishment because of the vagaries around their collection and interpretation, the poor quality of the available information and so on, and the danger of mistaking a temporary blip for an enduring trend. But there can be no denying that events have taken a disturbing turn and corrective action is required. Now, if we do nothing, if there's no concerted action, it's possible that the upward momentum will come to a halt as it has before, and early indications are that the rate of change has slowed down. Now, this might be because of capacity constraints and the increasing use of temporary release as a safety valve to reduce overcrowding, which means that while the number of sentenced prisoners continues to increase, the number actually incarcerated reaches a limit. So, while still on the subject of numbers, and before I move on to the 4 lacks that I've identified and offer a key performance indicator for the penal system and some recommendations for reform, there's one more important aspect of this issue to consider. the observed trend is way out of line with Irish Prison Service predictions. Now, in 2005, the Irish Prison Service projected that by 2015, the imprisonment rate per 100,000 population would have fallen slightly to 76. There were high and low projections too. The first suggested a rate of 79 and the latter a rate of 73. This raises an issue of central importance. Why were plans made at huge expense to expand the prison estate when the internal predictions suggested a downward trend in the imprisonment rate? In 2009, new predictions were prepared, again looking forward to 2015, and these were much more pessimistic than the early ones, as you can see from the slide. The best case scenario for 2015 was an imprisonment rate of 98, and the worst was a rate of 172. Now there's a huge gulf between those two estimates, and it's essentially an entire prison population of a difference between the two. And the 2015 worst case scenario that was projected in 2005 is more benign than the best case scenario for 2015 that was projected in 2009. So what happened between 2005 and 2009 to cause such a dystopian shift? The assumptions underlying the predictions haven't been made public, so we can't interrogate them. But one thing that changed was the commitment to prison expansionism, which dominated criminal justice planning during this period. Rather than seeing these projections as alarming, however wayward they might prove to be, they fed into a context where a commitment to expanding the number of prisoners was being embraced by key decision makers. A prison system demonstrating uncontrolled growth needs gigantic new prisons, so the argument goes. The fact that the imprisonment rate was not growing when the decision to expand was made seems to have been forgotten. And this, I think, is the crucial point to recognise. Just as prison populations can rise because politicians embrace punitiveness or neglect alternative ways of proceeding, so too can prison populations be brought down through acts of political decisiveness. It's for this reason that my remarks today, while reflecting concern at the situation that has been allowed to develop over many years, contain within them the seeds of optimism. The fact that equivalent or greater surges in the imprisonment rate during the 1980s and 1990s were followed by periods of stability is evidence that projections mislead if they assume uninterrupted growth, as seems to be the case with the most recent Irish Prison Service figures. Now I want to turn briefly to the four lacks that I've identified, beginning with the lack of urgency. It's important not to lose sight of the people behind the statistics. Imprisonment's about much more than numbers, and from time to time events occur that are so horrific they should act as pricks to the nation's conscience. Sometimes personalising an issue can be an engine for change. And to this end, I'd like to read an extract from a newspaper report that was published some time ago. Gary Douch, 21, was badly beaten and strangled in a sustained attack in a communal cell in Mountjoy Prison on the 1st of August 2006. His killer's excrement was found smeared on the dead man. The suspect, who was regarded as violent, had spent time recently in the Central Mental Hospital. There were 6 other prisoners in the cell sleeping on mattresses on the floor. None of them raised the alarm, and it was only when they had vacated the cell the following morning that prison officers found Mr. Douch lying among the mattresses. What's notable, first of all, about this sickening attack are the circumstances in which it took place. In a crowded cell where a predatory young man was outnumbered but unchallenged by his terrified cellmates. The fact that in a recent report the Council of Europe Committee for the Prevention of Torture declared that 3 Irish prisons were unsafe shows that this is not an inexplicable aberration. There's a wider context about prisoner safety that needs to be addressed urgently. A commission of investigation was set up the following year after a report by a former civil servant identified a number of serious deficiencies. When the Minister for Justice, it was Michael McDougall at the time, set up this commission headed by Gráinne McMorrow, Senior Counsel, In April 2007, and the dates, the chronology is important here, he announced that he expected it to report before the end of the year. The Commission had been established under the Commissions of Investigation Act 2004 because the government deemed Mr. Douch's death to raise matters of significant public concern. An 8-month time frame for a report with quite tightly defined terms of reference seemed realistic at the time. But even allowing for slippage, one might have expected a report by the end of the following year, by the end of 2008. It would appear that the inquiry has yet to report more than 4.5 years after its report was expected. Now, I understand a draft of the report has been circulated, people are commenting on it, and the finished product is some way distant even now. Not to bring such a tragic set of circumstances to a timely conclusion, for whatever reason or combination of reasons, sends out a powerful negative message about priorities. And quite apart from the personal tragedy for the Douch family, the events around this killing were deemed to be of significant public concern. That's why a statutory investigation was established in the first place. The absence of sustained debate that follows events such as the savagery and degradation that characterised Gary Douch's final hours suggests a deep reservoir of public and political apathy. By contrast, an inquiry into the murder of a young offender, Zahid Mubarak, by his cellmate in England was initiated in April 2004. The inquiry's 700-page, 2-volume report was published by the House of Commons in June 2006. This followed previous detailed investigations by the Prison Service and the Commission for Racial Equality. The UK government committed itself to providing a full response to the report's 88 recommendations within 2 months of the publication date. From the start of the process to the deadline for implementing all of the report's recommendations, 28 months. This compares with 65 months and counting for Gary Douch. I don't think I need to say anything else about the lack of urgency that characterises prison matters. My second lack is a corollary of the lack of urgency. So even when reports are brought to a conclusion, there's no guarantee that the recommendations will be implemented. And I'm just going to give one example of this, which is about prison hygiene. A prison hygiene policy group was set up in 1993. When its report was finally published in 1997, it contained very strong language about the importance of decent conditions and how a lack of in-cell sanitation was demeaning and degrading. It noted that the government already had plans to provide in-cell sanitation across the board by 1999 and recommended that that programme should be accelerated, and in the meantime 24-hour access to sanitation should be provided. As things stand, 15 years after the Prison Hygiene Policy Group reinforced the government's decision to abolish this disgusting practice, more than 1 in 4 prisoners continues to slop out. Now, in its 3-year strategic plan published on April the 30th of this year, the Irish Prison Service gave a commitment to end slopping out within 40 months, so the target is still moving. And I think it's salutary to remember that when Mountjoy Prison opened in 1850, each cell was fitted with a flushing toilet. If the current timetable is adhered to, we'll be back to this situation by the summer of 2015. Structure. One of the strengths of the Irish system in the past was its informal and discretionary nature, which allowed decisions to be tailored to individual circumstances. When serious crime was unusual and the prison population was low, this meant that prisoners benefited in ways that are no longer the case. Now, time is short, so I just got to give one quick example of where a lack of structure that was unproblematic in the past has become problematic today. And that's the species of temporary release that we call parole. This process remains avowedly political. It lacks formality, transparency, and independence. The Minister for Justice and Law Reform makes a determination on the issue of release for every life sentenced and long-term offender having received a recommendation from the parole board. The secrecy surrounding the parole process does not serve prisoners, decision makers, victims and victims' families, or the public. The scrutiny of parole in other jurisdictions has facilitated greater levels of accountability, produced research to assist in restructuring both the process and individual decision making, and fostered a more open approach to the provision of information to prisoners, the public and victims. There's been no such scrutiny in Ireland, but things have changed profoundly for those serving long sentences. Lifers released on licence today will have spent a decade longer in custody than their counterparts who were released in the early 1980s. 17 years as opposed to 7.5 years. So the structure of parole requires a radical overhaul, and I have a recommendation to make in this regard that I'll return to in a few minutes. The extent to which the criminal justice system operates in the absence of informed comment, research and critical scrutiny is striking. The good quality information that's required to allow a sensible discussion largely is non-existent. Substantial data deficits remain at every level, and progress linking systems from the different agencies is slow. There are still far too many simple questions that cannot be answered. For example, what is the average sentence for a first-time burglar? Do members of minority groups experience the criminal justice system differently? How many years of imprisonment do the courts impose each year? What does it feel like to be in prison? And so on. All of the lacks that I've identified, urgency, follow-through, structure and critical scrutiny, have been allowed to persist because of a final lack, that of public concern. It's become a platitude to say that a country has the criminal justice system it deserves, but there can be little doubt that such a parlous state of affairs would be less likely to persist in the face of sustained public opposition. I'm not arguing that there's been anything deliberate about the processes that I've identified, but benign neglect has had malign effect. And the confluence of these streams leads to what I call corrosive drift. When action is taken, it's often disproportionate or short-lived, or both. Now, as I move on to a conclusion, I want to offer one objective measure of policy performance. I'll set out a single, easily stated objective with which policy should be aligned and give a time frame for its achievement. When I showed in the first slide the prison population in 1999, you might remember it was 20 points below the EU average. It was 65 in Ireland versus 85 across the EU. When the 9th edition appeared in 2011, we'd moved up to occupy the average position of 100. Now, it might be too ambitious to suggest that we get back to a rate of 65, given the slight upward drift in comparator countries, but I think it would be reasonable to argue for a return to our relative position. So in other words, we'd once again take up a position 20 points below average. What would that mean at the moment? Well, an imprisonment rate of around 80 per 100,000. As most of the increase that I've described took place during the last 5 years, a similar time frame seems appropriate in terms of bringing the situation back under control. So to put this in concrete terms, assuming everything else remains constant, the national population, the rates of change in other countries and so on, we're talking about aiming to bring the prison population from around 4,500 to around 3,600, and to do this by 2017. Now, it says something about the reckless expansion that's characterised the last decade, that this modest target will probably be considered wildly ambitious by those with a responsibility for penal planning. So it's important to stress that we didn't cross this threshold in terms of numbers until 2009. I think it's encouraging that the Minister and the new Director General of the Prison Service have embraced the principle of parsimony in the use of punishment, and it's refreshing to hear them talk about approaches other than expansionism and new buildings. Time will tell whether a more considered approach along the lines they're advocating has the desired effect. Decentering the prison is in everyone's interest. It's not just about cost savings, although there may be some of these. It's about fairness and it's about justice. Prisons bear down most heavily on those who are already marginalised in numerous ways. And given the current economic crisis that absorbs all of us who are resident in this jurisdiction, there can be few people who cling to the eccentric belief that the petty, persistent thieves and rowdy drunks and fine defaulters who account for the majority of prison admissions each year, are those who have done the greatest damage to Irish society and deserve increasingly harsh treatment. Indeed, one wonders if the criminal justice system devoted as much attention to white-collar offenders as to fine defaulters, would its deficiencies be addressed with greater determination and speed. Now, conference speakers were invited to offer concrete proposals. I've got 3, and I think they have one virtue, which is that it lies within the powers of those who make law and policy in the area to give effect to them. They don't require wider social transformation. They don't require the reduction of income inequality. They don't require a shift in public opinion or a downward spiral in the crime rate. They don't require an overhaul of sentencing practice. These are all, no doubt, desirable things in their own right, but they're difficult and they're time-consuming to achieve, and certainly the realisation would extend beyond the lifetime of any one government, thus lessening the political attractiveness, if you like. So what are my recommendations? The first is to support temporary release, the second to reform parole, and the third to remember remission. Maybe we can sort that out. I'll speak for a moment or two on each of these, and then I'll wind up. The law allows for temporary release, TR, on humanitarian or family grounds, or to facilitate vocational training. And this can be granted on a renewable basis over a fixed period of time until the sentence expiry date. I think the willingness to exercise discretion in favour of prisoners and their families says something about the emphasis the prison system places on trust. I think it's a more eloquent expression of faith in the individual's capacity to rise to expectations than any mission statement or set of performance measures. And the granting of TR to a significant number of prisoners every Christmas used to be a defining characteristic of the Irish prison system. It's virtually disappeared. On average, between the early 1960s and the mid-1990s, more than 1 in 8 prisoners were allowed home for Christmas. Last year, the figure was 1 in 25. A part of this explanation must lie in the emergence of a more diverse prison population. There are more remand prisoners. They're ineligible for temporary release. There are more prisoners from overseas. They may lack the requisite community contacts. But it may also indicate a punitive shift within the criminal justice system and the emergence of a less forgiving mentality on the part of those with whom the power to grant TR resides. I think the decline of this practice indicates the oozing of compassion from a system that was characterised by it. Temporary release is important because it's effective. A follow-up study of 20,000 prisoner releases carried out at the UCD Institute of Criminology showed that prisoners who were occasionally allowed outside for vocational or family-related purposes were less likely to be re-imprisoned, and this held for 4 years post-release. So that's a good empirical demonstration of the benefits, other than purely humanitarian ones, of maintaining prisoners' social capital. And when prisoners repay trust with good behaviour, there are rewards, I think, for all of us. The second recommendation I have for change is about reforming parole. I've mentioned already how little has changed in parole decision-making in the last half century. And I think there's one step that could be taken without delay here, and that's to widen the parole eligibility window. I'll just give one statistic to illustrate that. In Finland, parole is possible after 14 days. In Ireland, the earliest possible review is after 1,460 days. My recommendation here is, why not make parole a possibility for anyone sentenced to 4 years or more rather than 8 years or more, which is the present situation. My third recommendation, and I'll just mention in 30 seconds and then make my concluding remarks, is to remember remission. Enhanced remission, everybody who serves a determinate sentence of imprisonment gets 25% chopped off. They can lose it if they misbehave. It's possible under the prison rules for somebody to get enhanced remission, which is a 33% reduction, if they take part in treatment programs. The potential of this facility to reduce sentences hasn't been exploited. Employing it more widely would serve several purposes. It would incentivise prisoners to take part in programs that reduce the threat they pose, reduce prison overcrowding, usher in a more structured approach to release, and save money. So to conclude, I'd like to note that politicians in Ireland, perhaps unlike their counterparts in other areas, have sometimes shown commendable restraint when it comes to setting the tone of the debate about crime and punishment. And the challenge today is to create a context where citizens believe the penal system to be legitimate and trust legislators to formulate rational, effective and proportionate responses, and where legislators are confident enough to challenge the centrality of the prison at every opportunity. Now, getting this right is extremely difficult, but vitally important. To facilitate such a process, it would be necessary to begin a new national conversation about the place of the prison in society, to reimagine the prison as this conference enjoins us to do. And I've a suggestion about how we might begin this dialogue that I just mentioned to you before I sit down. Why not start the conversation going by bringing together serving and former prisoners academics, policymakers, politicians, judges, and reform groups. Following the model perhaps established in Norway, where since 1968 there's a 3-day conference every year in the same place around the same time of the year, where people from each side of the criminal justice divide come together to share experiences and engage in mutual learning. These conferences are attended by social workers, lawyers, researchers, officials from the Ministry for Justice, prison service personnel, and so on. Prisoners are granted temporary release to attend. In the early days, officials from the ministry refused to participate. Now they do so as a matter of course. The debates are fairly vigorous at these meetings, and the exchanges are open, and complacency is challenged, contacts are built up, and so on. There's an opportunity to think more deeply about issues that are sometimes responded to hastily in a crisis or superficially by an excitable media. Now, if we tried such an initiative here, I think there'd be predictable hoots of derision from certain quarters about pampered prisoners enjoying hotel breaks at the expense of the hard-pressed taxpayer. But I think that such opposition could be overcome if the impetus to organise a discussion like that existed. I think that public attitudes to punishment are ambivalent. An unforgiving streak coexists with an appetite for restorative justice. A desire to see criminals receive their just deserts sits alongside an appreciation that those who come before the court, the worst offenders, are the greatest threats to society. Rehabilitation, retribution, deterrence, and incapacitation are all jostling for attention in the public mind. So what would be wrong with giving judges and politicians an opportunity to learn firsthand about the real impact of imprisonment? I think that this might be one way of narrowing the empathy gap that exists between offenders and those who deal with them. Now, it would be naive to think that such an event in isolation would have a transformative impact or bring our prison population down to an acceptable level. But one thing I think is certain: the public would benefit from a slimmed down prison system, which released men and women who are less angry, less embittered, and better equipped to play a constructive role in society. And any step that might take us in that direction is worth considering. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian, for a very thought-provoking and practical contribution. Now, what I propose to do is take a couple of questions to Ian, which might arise out of what he has been saying, which people might forget about after the next presentation, but only a couple because we then want to give adequate time to Shana as well. So we have a microphone. Angelina has a roving microphone there. Have we any questions? Or maybe he has just so shocked you and into submission that everybody agrees with everything he said. Somebody up there.
Mr. Cameron, get to go on the project. Recently I was part of a group that visited Clover Hill Prison, and the governor there unveiled a new approach to dealing with prisoners pre-release and post-release, you know. And there was a group of people there from the community groups and what have you, you know. And they put on a lovely meal there and everything, and it was all very nice. So in terms of what you were saying earlier about a forum, you know, I think that's a brilliant idea, and a way of getting around the backlash in the media would be to hold it in the prison.
Well, I think that's more a comment, an endorsing comment than a question. Anybody else? This lady here.
Jean Coulson from the UK Parliament. I wanted to watch Great Ian and study what happened in New York, where all of a sudden good law-abiding citizens found they couldn't walk through Times Square without risk of being mugged, and there was a huge outcry. And in the few years since, the prison population in New York has halved, and so has crime. So if it can be done in New York, sure it can be done in Ireland.
Absolutely. You can hear me from this. Yeah, I suppose one thing I'd be concerned with, I'd agree with that, is to decouple the trend in crime from the trend in imprisonment. And to emphasise, as I tried to do, I've used words very deliberately, like we've allowed this to happen, I said on a couple of occasions, because these things happen for reasons, and the reasons are politically driven often, and that just as absence of political decisiveness can allow a thing to drift upwards, the presence of political decisiveness can pull it back down again. So I'd agree with that entirely. If there was a sufficient degree of interest in pulling the prison population down, it could be done, and to just leave aside the crime rate completely. And we had an interesting situation in Ireland when the prison population grew dramatically in the late 1990s. It took place after the crime rate had begun to fall and fell in a pretty established way. So these things aren't closely related, as you know, and I think it's important for politicians here to separate the two of them. And they can do something concrete about the prison population in the lifetime of the government, much more difficult to do something concrete about the crime rate over the same time period.
Thank you. I think there was another woman just here.
Sheila Connolly, the Cork Alliance Centre. Sorry, Ian, it's just a question in relation to your confidence support into your, and I just wondered what you thought of the current programme, the starter programme on the community return scheme that the Minister and the DG have kind of been pushing forward, and the value that that has for both the prisoners and the community at large.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good initiative, and it might have a modest impact. I think with TR, temporary release came into disrepute because it was being used almost exclusively as a safety valve. When prisons got too full, and the governors would fax in their lists, and people would be let out, and there was a poor correlation between the sentence imposed and the time served. That's not a satisfactory situation. I'm talking about temporary release that's structured for the maintenance of family ties, the acquisition of vocational skills, and so on. And the Minister's new initiative to allow people out earlier than they would otherwise get out, to avail of these kinds of things, I think I'd have to applaud that. And that's when I was speaking earlier on, I said that maybe there's a wind of change is maybe a bit strong, a breeze of change, or there's a kind of, it seems to be an air now where the solution isn't we buy another field and put a wall around it and commit vast quantities of money to building a prison. It's about thinking a bit more imaginatively of ways to deal with a problem that remains a manageable problem. Okay,
I think we'll go on to the next speaker now because we are a bit short of time. And the next speaker is Shad Maruna, who I'm pleased to note comes from my own former university, Queen's University in Belfast, but by a fairly circuitous route. He's Professor of Justice and Human Development in the School of Law in Queen's, but he previously taught at the State University of New York and the University of Cambridge, and he has a PhD in Human Development and Social Policy from Northwestern University in Chicago. In 2001, his book, Making Good, was awarded the Outstanding Contribution to Criminology by the American Society of Criminology. And in 2004, he was named as the Distinguished New Scholar in Corrections and Sentencing by the American Society of Criminology. He's currently a Soros Justice Fellow and has previously been a Fulbright Scholar and a Guggenheim Fellow. And Shad is going to talk on the topic, what role can prison have in rehabilitation and reintegration? And I think from that short biography, it's clear we're going to get the benefit of knowledge and research across two continents, which is going to be particularly valuable for us. So, Shad.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here today. Delighted to be asked to address such an interesting and distinguished group as yourselves. Like Ian, I was given a very clear steer when I was invited. They asked me to speak to this question here of what role do prisons have in rehabilitation and reintegration. I get invited to do a lot of these talks. I'm never quite sure why, and you'll probably wonder the same thing as I go on today. And oftentimes the organizers will set me a topic like this, and usually I will just ignore the topic they set and talk about what I want to talk about. They don't pay us, so we can do that. But in this case, and I was tempted to do that today. I was tempted to do it for a number of reasons. For one, I've been asking that question now for 15 years or so in academia, and I still don't have an answer. either an empirical answer to the question of can prisons rehabilitate people, or to the normative question of whether they should be in the business of rehabilitating or trying to rehabilitate prisoners. I used to know the answer to both of those questions a while back, and then you spend 15 years studying it, and it becomes less and less clear the more you do. Another problem with that topic is that my great friend Alison Liebling was posed an almost identical question at a different conference last year. Does prison have a role to play in the desistance process? And if any of you are on your handheld computers as I speak, you will want to Google that talk. I did some research before this talk and made the mistake of reading that, and it's an awfully hard act to follow. I can say you're lucky enough that Alison will be speaking to tomorrow on a different topic, but I won't just plagiarize what she said in that talk, but I do recommend it for those who are interested. Interestingly, some of you will know Alison and I come from very different starting places. Alison is of course a prison researcher like Ian, and starts from that institutional or organizational framework as sociology. Myself, I'm not a real prison person. I'm far too claustrophobic to spend as much time as these folks do in prisons, although I'm spending more and more time recently. I started life as a developmental psychologist, and as you heard about my research in this book and others is in the process of how individuals grow out or mature out or move out of criminal behavior in the life course, this process that we call desistance from crime. So essentially in this book and others, I start from a rather different vantage point of the success stories and have worked my way back to trying to understand prison from their perspective, a perspective that's not heard very often in criminology. And it's sort of like opening a film with the ending and it being a happy ending and sort of saying, now watch the rest of the film and we're going to figure out how they got to this point. But I start from that position and work my way back, while Alison started in the prison itself and indeed in some of the harsh realities of the prison itself, the suicide in particular, and has moved instead into trying to understand those outcomes, and in her words, how people can flourish in a place like a prison. So we've met in the middle here, and a number of us, and Ian also, are interested in this question from a variety of different angles. I should say that neither of us start with the question that politicians like of whether prison works as a question, whether prison works presumably to reduce recidivism, although that part isn't mentioned. To answer a question like, does prison work, one would have to make too many presumptions as far as I'm concerned. First and foremost, what this thing is that we call a prison, and the assumption that a prison is a prison is a prison, and likewise that success outcomes and so forth could be measured reliably. If you make those assumptions, and researchers have, you could try to compare samples of individuals who get sent to prison with comparable samples of those who don't get sent to prisons across multiple studies, put them together in meta-analyses, and try to answer this question of does prison work. When you do that, the researchers basically find nothing much. They find that prisons don't seem to reduce recidivism by any means. We all know the statistics by now, 50, 60, 70% recidivism rates, but also prisons don't seem to cause any more recidivism either. They just don't do much of anything. And that is obviously a lot of money and a lot of trouble for a lot of nothing much in terms of outcomes, with prison expenditures exceeding spending on higher education and literally bankrupting some of the states in America where I come from. But more importantly, for everyone in this room, and I know there's a lot of prison experience in this room of all sorts, everyone here from that human level that Ian described knows that there's nothing neutral about a prison experience. It's simply impossible that a total institution like the prison, the most severe, profound social sanction we can allow in Europe, simply has no impact on individuals' lives. Of course it does. It did for the individuals who commit suicide in Alison's research. It did for the successes in my research. It's the question itself, does prison work, that is wrong. The truth is that it works different ways for different people. Some have the most tragic outcomes. Others do experience prison as a turning point in their lives, a point whether it be for deterrence or rehabilitation or neither. Sometimes prison can be a moment of change. And it's this, I guess, this optimistic topic that I'm been asked to speak to today, and that I'm often asked to speak about at conferences like this, these successes that I start from. I study redemption, I study comeback stories. Again, I like happy endings. It gets you, though, a reputation as this overly optimistic, quite naive guy. I don't think being an American helps much in that regard. But ironically, I think that I gravitate to these success stories largely because I am such a naturally negative and pessimistic person. I think if I focused on the kind of stories that Ian and Alison do every day, I think I would slip into despondency and alcoholism much too quickly. So I will get to the positive by the end of this talk. But the crucial, and here we get back into the normative question, the crucial point that's already been made very well by both of our speakers before me, and especially if there's sentencers among us, or journalists and media people, policymakers, if you want to turn someone's life around, if you want the success stories that I'm talking about, then prison, any prison, even good prisons, are not the place to do that. That's the bottom line. In my research, we have identified a number of factors that consistently seem to be related to desistance from crime, to the kind of success that I'm talking about. This isn't rocket science. It appears that when people find stable, good, healthy relationships, regardless of the sex of the person they're in a relationship with, we human beings are naturally social creatures, and stable relationships seem to go some way into supporting desistance from crime. Likewise, stable employment, Freud said the two things one needs in life are love and work. You need a job, you need to be able to support yourself. Employment gives us a number of things, but importantly, that kind of paycheck and the stability and so forth. Some research suggests that 1 and 2 aren't as important as the third. What employment and relationships do is they get us away from our peer group set, and we know that most crime is committed in groups. We know that when you spend a lot of time as an 18-year-old male hanging around with other 18-year-old males, you're more likely to get in trouble than when that 18-year-old male is in a place of employment, is in a stable relationship, and moves